can be supranational.
Yes.
You can meet someone from across the world, but if you both share the language of music, you can communicate with each other through beauty.
Which is more or less the popular story of how jazz comes about in the first place. It's been told a number of times. The origin story may be partially apocryphal, but essentially you have a number of people from all over the world speaking a host of different languages, living in a flop house in New Orleans, and the only way to really communicate effectively is to play music together, and they harmonize with each other. And
I mean, the fascinating thing about jazz is that because it's improvisational, you've got a lot of ideas being introduced, and someone will go off on their own thing, and the challenge of each musician around them is to take that idea and to bring it into harmony with all of the others around them. And that when you see real live jazz, what you're watching is this conversation as someone says, hey, I've got an idea, and everyone's like, all right, great, let's see how we can make it work with the rest of us.
It follows the rules of theatrical improv, where one of the first rules is yes and. You
Yes.
don't shut your interlocutor down, you agree and you amplify, and then maybe you transform it, and there's a lot of play there.
And in fact, this metaphor was used by J.R.R. Tolkien in the Silmarillion. In his, what is it? What's the name when you've basically got the cosmogony?
It's a theogony as much as a cosmogony.
It's both.
It describes the origin of the universe and the gods that the characters of Middle-earth in The Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings actually inhabit. None of the material was actually used in the recent Amazon Rings of Power series.
I think that's supposed to be taking place in the Second Age anyway, so it's well past that, even if they hadn't ignored elements.
Anyway.
Anyway.
So you're not going to get any of this out of watching Rings of Power, is what I'm trying to say.
Yes.
But in the Silmarillion, which is, I find it a very, very difficult
It's
text
a hard
to
work
read through.
because it's notes.
It is. And his son Christopher did a marvelous job modifying them. There are some very good stories in there. But key to, at the very beginning, Tolkien basically lays out his creation story for Middle-earth. And in it, Iluvatar, the great over-god, the god who pre-exists all other gods, the unmoved prime mover, to use the Aristotelian phrase, begins a song. And with that song, Iluvatar sings all of Middle-earth into being, and he sings the Valar and the Maiar, and then they begin singing and playing, and they bring into existence all of the birds and beasts and trees and fishes, and finally the elves and the men.
And creation is described as an act of musical composition.
And what sustains creation is that they continue the song. It's not like they sing it into being and then it stops.
Well, the most important moment, though, of the story is the moment where one of the characters,
Morgoth,
enters in a discordant note.
Yes.
And for those of you familiar with Christian and Hebrew stories, you're recognizing this is the moment where Lucifer comes in and gives his moment of self-will and says, I'm not going to go along with this. Within this story, that's Morgoth entering in his note of discord. And what Iluvatar does is not eliminate the player or the note, but instead reshape all the music around it to recreate harmony.
Yes. And that takes time. It takes time for that discordant note to be incorporated into the harmony. And it's uncomfortable while it's out there. And Morgoth, of course, being Morgoth, keeps creating discordant notes. But Iluvatar encourages the rest of the beings he's sung into being to keep reshaping the music so that it remains beautiful and can incorporate this dissonance.
Mm-hmm. But back to Suzuki, what you are seeking is that ability to communicate with others through beauty.
Yes.
And that was the recognition, and I have actually seen this in action in the real world. I have a friend of ours. He comes from a very musical family. He himself has played professionally for years. His brother, also a professional musician, has traveled around the world working on national symphonies in places including in Afghanistan.
He built up a national symphony in Afghanistan. Last I heard, he was building one up in Mexico? Or
Yes.
Yeah.
But he's traveled around the world with making these connections with people, and they might not share anything else, coming from different backgrounds, different faiths, everything about them is different, but the one thing they share is that love of music.
Mm-hmm.
And from that, they can build this common understanding that says, I care about your life and your existence, your personhood. And it starts from that shared love of music. And that's what Dr. Suzuki was aiming at, and why beauty could transform the soul. Because if you could, through music, gain this love of...
And not just music, anything that is beautiful. An argument can be beautiful, a mathematical proof can be beautiful, an essay. We tend to think of beauty as purely aesthetic.
Yes.
And that's why it's one of the first things, programs that might have children encounter beauty are some of the first ones cut in schools. The lamentations of celebrities about how funding for arts and theater and music are being cut in schools.
Talk to any music teacher. If you have ever known someone who taught music, public, private, it doesn't matter. Their program is always the one that's on the chopping block and at risk of being discontinued.
Yes.
Or considered, expendable.
And in most of the homeschooling curricula out there, most of the programs being sold by homeschooling vendors, beauty's an afterthought. The focus is on textbooks, workbooks, consumables, online classes, but a lot of parents don't understand how critical this is, so they don't make it a priority, with the net result that children may end up with a lot of facts in their head, and they may have a kind of vague sense of right versus wrong in a moral and ethical dimension. But they have had no exposure to the true, the good, or the beautiful, because that aspect of their education was wholly neglected.
And I think that brings us into sort of the practical side of this, is like if you can start beginning to say, okay, I'm starting to see how beauty has a lot more of a role in the formation of the person. And that's the heart of education. Education is paideia. It's the leading of the child toward these things.
Yeah, educare. And paideia is a Greek term, and it's the Greek term for what we call education. Education being derived from the Latin to lead out of, as in to lead out of the cave of ignorance, the cave of sloth, the cave of moral turpitude, essentially, and to lead into being what society would recognize as a good man, a good woman, a good person. Paideia was all of those things that comprised. It was all of that knowledge that comprised that you would know your poets, and you would know your poetical structures. You would know what the medievals came to call, after the late Roman period, the trivium and the quadrivium.
Yes.
And
the trivium and the quadrivium can sometimes be described as your language arts and your maths and sciences, but that's not really what they were.
That's far too limited a modern reduction of what the trivium and quadrivium were, because the trivium constituted grammar, dialectic, and rhetoric, where grammar encompassed both literary content and analysis, as well as what we would think of as grammar, sentence structure, syntax, punctuation, etc. Dialectic is more than just formal or informal logic. It's the whole way of constructing true arguments and being able to recognize them, and dissecting false arguments and being able to recognize them. And then rhetoric is how to make the speech beautiful. So even in the structure of the trivium, you see the true, the good, and the beautiful
manifest. Can you make
manifest.
A good sentence? A sentence that makes sense, that says something.
And conveys an idea correctly and safely.
Truth.
To its listener.
And can you make it beautiful?
That which is uttered is received in the mode of the receiver. To badly paraphrase an assertion of Thomas Aquinas. So it's on you as the speaker, as the writer, to make yourself clear. And grammar, dialectic, and rhetoric are three aspects that have to go into any kind of linguistic effort. Now, in the ancient world, this was oriented towards oratory and public speaking. In the modern world, it can be applied to that. It can also, so speech and debate would also be considered an aspect of this in the ancient and the medieval world, really anything prior to the modern world.
Yeah.
It would include knowledge of poetry. It would include knowledge of literature. It would include knowledge of what we would now classify as history.
Because studying the histories, you are studying writers as well as gaining a body of knowledge that you can use to speak truly about things that might affect one's audience. Is pointing back to historical events.
Right. And one of the things, it was a huge thing to talk about 20 years ago when we started homeschooling, was everyone was focused on the trivium. Well, the quadrivium got neglected. Partially because nobody understands it in the modern world, because it violates the modern categories.
Right.
But also because it just doesn't make sense to the way we organize knowledge in this day and age, because the quadrivium was mathematics, physics, music, and astronomy. But what the ancients mean by those four terms is not what we mean in the modern world.
It wasn't even mathematics. It was arithmetic and geometry.
Arithmetic, geometry.
So you've got
music and astronomy.
And so it doesn't...
And physics was subsumed in natural philosophy.
Yes, physics was subsumed in natural philosophy, and most of what we think of as physics was covered under astronomy, because astronomy is about the movement of...
It's bodies in motion.
Bodies...
So arithmetic is the measurement of quantities. Geometry was the measurement of quantities in space.
Yes.
So objects with what we would now call three-dimensional volume. Music was the evaluation of relationships, bodies in relation to one another. And astronomy was the evaluation of bodies in motion in relation to one another.
Yes. And so once you see that schema, you can start to see why we group maths and sciences in the modern world together as separate from the other things, because all of them have to do with measurement in some respect.
Mm-hmm.
And you can also see how there's elements of chemistry or biology that don't fit in there at all.
Right.
Because they're something different entirely. There's a point at which, measurement might be a necessary aspect, but the majority of what you're doing is more about understanding a body of knowledge and about an inquiry into the nature of reality,
right,
which is an aspect of an aspect of philosophy, which is why it's called natural philosophy.
But underlying all of those disciplines within the trivium and quadrivium was the assumption that it had to be beautiful. And in being beautiful, it should help habituate the student to recognizing that which was true and being able to thus recognize that which was good. Because good was more than just morally or ethically correct behavior. Just as truth was more than that which was factually establishable. And beauty was far beyond just what was pretty or aesthetically pleasing.
Yes. And as you were pointing out, math can be beautiful.
Yes.
And
I struggle to see the beauty in it, but that is a deficiency in my own character and upbringing.
But I think a great example would be geometry. Geometry is an aspect of math that sometimes kind of feels like the baffling cousin or redheaded stepchild of the math world,
mm-hmm,
because everything else feels like it flows, and then you've got this one spot that's like, what on earth are these proofs? This is a completely different way to math.
Yes.
And it's...
Because geometry is not about calculation.
No.
And the problem is we live in a society that says mathematics is about calculation, which is why geometry doesn't fit.
And so once you've, done years and years of arithmetic, and then you do some algebra, and then having completed your Algebra 1 course, you're dumped into geometry, and you're baffled.
Right.
And the reason is because what you're doing in geometry is a lot closer to philosophy. It's an inquiry into the nature of what is triangleness, and starting with a definition of what a triangle is. And then once you've got things like a triangle is an object with 3 sides and 3 interior angles, and only 3 sides and only 3 interior angles. And then you can start making sets of proofs where if this thing is true, and this thing is true, and this thing is true, then this fourth thing must, by definition also be true. Quod erat demonstrandum.
And that's why Plato, very famously, although possibly apocryphally, said, "Let no one enter without geometry," meaning no one could enter the academy he founded in Athens to study philosophy with him unless they had a firm grounding in geometry.
Well, one of the things you find out once you've spent enough time doing proofs is if you talk to mathematicians, they'll talk about an elegant proof. They'll talk about a proof that flows so beautifully that there is something that causes you to step back in awe.
I've seen that with computer code. I've seen programmers who've written elegant code solutions to very, very knotty problems.
And when you see how this problem that you thought was difficult or was going to require a very messy and not ideal solution, that someone comes up with a solution that makes sense, you are seeing beauty. You are seeing order. And one of the aspects of beauty is order. When something just comes out so nicely that you go, wow. And that's how you start seeing, how does math still fit into this pursuit of beauty? When you want to say, well, what about physics?
Right.
Well, once you've done the physics involved in wiring a house, I'm not kidding. We actually did this. We were wiring a theater.
It was a theater. We had to rewire the theater.
And
the electrician taught me more about electromagnetic theory and physics because, well, one, if I did it wrong, I was going to kill us all. But two, he understood it on an experiential level in a way that my physics professor or teacher in high school, great bass player though he was, had no idea. He knew it from books and he could teach it from the textbook, but he had no real life experience. Whereas, I think Ernie was his name.
Yeah.
Ernie, good Lord, that man knew physics back and forth in 6 Ways from Sunday within his limited sphere of experience. He knew he couldn't go and become a physics teacher, and he didn't want to, but he was a damn good electrician.
And from the perspective of...
And he was a good rigger, so he understood objects and weights and counterweights and fly systems and just an incredible encyclopedia of knowledge.
Technical theater, it's an excellent way to learn a huge, huge amount of physics on a experiential level.
Well, it used to be. I don't know if it still is.
Anyways, rewiring that theater, finally, direct and alternating current made sense. It had not made sense in the book. And I was very bad at the whole electricity portion of my physics class. I was an average physics student. That was the first time it finally made sense. And once it did, all of the elements of setting up that system so that it flowed was beautiful.
Yeah. So that's actually one of the secrets to doing this effectively is you've got to start with the concrete and the specific and the experiential. And you've got to lay that foundation starting as early as possible so that as your child ages, as they develop, as they start studying these things in more abstract ways, they still have concrete experience to rely on in order to make sense of all of the information.
Another aspect that I was thinking is, like, you can think of classes like art and music are obviously going to cover aspects of beauty, but how you teach them makes a difference.
Yes.
Because I think the thing to keep in mind is that, for example, with art, there is the technical aspect, how to actually create something, whether it's a piece of pottery or a painting. And there is, on the other side, what we might call art appreciation. And that's just spending time with a piece of art to listen to it or view it and
to experience
it, and you need to make time for both. And so with music, which really does have a place, I think, in school, in education rather, it has a place, and learning an instrument is very valuable because it gives you an experiential element of music. You start learning.
It is very difficult to learn any music theory, even rudimentary music theory, if you have never played an instrument and you don't know how to sing.
Yes.
And so music education needs to be more than just playing an instrument grudgingly and, arguing about practicing. That's kind of a conversation on its own.
Yes.
But it needs over time, as familiarity with the instrument, whether the instrument is the voice or a physical, external to the human being instrument, percussion or keyboard or whatever, ukulele.
Recorder.
Whatever instrument your child is learning, that needs to be part of the music education, in that they should be listening to good music as much as possible, broadening their horizons, learning a bit about composers and whatnot.
And so if you were going to do...
And all that is foundational for learning some music theory as they get into adolescence.